My name is Rachel Connors. I am 34 years old. I am a pediatric nurse. And I want to tell you about the 11 days I spent unconscious in a hospital bed, and what my husband's family did with those 11 days while I was not there to stop them. I want to start with what happened when I woke up, because the beginning only makes sense once you understand the ending. I opened my eyes on a Thursday afternoon in February. The room was white and bright and smelled like antiseptic, and the particular kind of quiet that hospitals have at 3 in the afternoon when visiting hours are technically over, but the nurses haven't started their evening rounds. My husband, Daniel, was sitting in the chair beside my bed. He had his phone in his lap, and he was looking at the window. When I moved my hand, he looked over and he smiled, and it was a real smile, the kind that starts in the eyes before it reaches the mouth. He said, "Hey." I said, "Hey." He said, "You scared me." I said, "I scared myself." He laughed, a small exhale that I understood contained 11 days of held breath finally being released. I tried to sit up, and my body informed me that sitting up was not yet on the approved list of activities. I lay back down. I looked at the ceiling. I said, "How long?" He said, 11 days. I closed my eyes. When you are a nurse, 11 days unconscious has a specific meaning. You understand, in a clinical way, what 11 days of your body fighting without your conscious participation means, what it costs, what the recovery looks like. I lay there with that understanding and let it settle. Then I said, "Is the house okay?" And Daniel went quiet in a way that was different from the quiet of someone who is gathering themselves to deliver difficult news. It was the quiet of someone who has been waiting for this specific question and is not sure how to begin the answer. I opened my eyes. I looked at him. "Daniel," I said, and he told me, "Welcome back to Peaceful Drama Stories TV. If you've ever had someone make a decision about your life while you weren't there to protect yourself, this story is going to land somewhere deep. Subscribe, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, and stay with me. Because what those 11 days contained is something I am still, 18 months later, fully processing. Let me back up to before the hospital. Before the hospital, there was a life that Daniel and I had built together across 6 years of marriage that had been, in most important ways, genuinely good. We had met in our late 20s, when I was 2 years into my nursing career, and he was just finishing his MBA. He was funny and steady, and he listened to me, really listened, in the way that some people do, where you can feel their attention, like a physical presence in the room. We dated for 2 years, and then we got married in a small ceremony in the backyard of my parents' house in Maplewood, New Jersey, with 40 guests, and my mother's homemade cake, and a string of lights in the oak tree that my father had spent an entire Saturday afternoon hanging. It was exactly what I wanted. It was enough. We moved to Columbus, Ohio for Daniel's job. I transferred my nursing license and found a position in the pediatric ward at a children's hospital downtown, which is where I had always wanted to work and which turned out to be exactly as hard and exactly as meaningful as I had imagined it would be. We rented for the first 2 years, saving carefully, and then we bought a house on Elmwood Drive, a 3-bedroom craftsman with a front porch and a backyard with a maple tree and a kitchen that needed updating, but had good bones. I had spent 4 months of evenings and weekends painting and refinishing and rearranging until it felt like ours. The down payment was 60% from my savings, money I had been putting away since I was 22, and 40% from a joint account we had built together over 2 years of deliberate saving. The house was in both our names. It was the most significant thing either of us had ever owned. I loved it with the specific love you have for the first place that is entirely and completely yours. Now, I need to tell you about Daniel's family, and I want to do this carefully, because the family of a person you love is something you come to know slowly, and the knowing is often more complicated than the introduction suggested. Daniel's parents were Robert and Beverly Whitmore. Robert had retired from a regional insurance company where he had worked for 32 years. Beverly had spent those same 32 years managing their household and their 3 children with the particular efficiency of a woman who treated family logistics the way some people treat a full-time career, with complete investment, clear expectations, and limited tolerance for deviation from the established system. They were not unkind to me in the beginning. Beverly was warm in a managed way, the kind of warmth that has limits she is aware of even if she never states them explicitly. Robert was quieter, the kind of man who expressed approval through the absence of criticism. Daniel's older brother Marcus lived 20 minutes away with his wife Sandra and their 2 children. Daniel's younger sister Kelsey was single, 30, and still very much operating in the orbit of her mother's approval in ways that I recognized, but that were not my place to name. The 5 of them had a family dynamic that was functional and loving, and also had, as all family dynamics do, its pressure points and its unspoken hierarchies. I was not born into that dynamic. I had married into it at 30, with my own established life, my own parents, my own habits and opinions and ways of being in the world. This is not a problem in itself, but it became a context that mattered. Beverly's relationship with our house started early and was consistent. She had opinions about the color of the front door, which she expressed twice. She had opinions about the guest room, which she thought should be kept available rather than used as my home office, which she expressed 4 times across 2 years in various forms. She had opinions about the neighborhood, which she considered a long way from Daniel's workplace, and which she expressed in the form of forwarding real estate listings from closer neighborhoods approximately every 3 months for the first 2 years we lived there. She was never aggressive about any of this. She was pleasant. She used the word practical a great deal. She framed everything as concern. She never once said, "This is my son's house, and I have a stake in it." But the accumulated weight of the opinions communicated without ambiguity that she believed she had a stake in it. I talked to Daniel about this twice. He said, "She means well." He said, "She just loves us." He said, "It'll calm down." It did not calm down. It shifted. Around the 3rd year of our time in the house, Beverly stopped making suggestions about what we should change and started making suggestions about what we should do instead of keeping the house. The suggestions were always framed as opportunities. An apartment closer to Daniel's office, a larger house in a newer neighborhood, a different arrangement entirely, she said once, quite directly, that I pretended not to hear, because arrangements are easier when family is involved in the decisions. I did not know, during those years, that Beverly had a specific vision for what the arrangement should be. I found out, much later, from a source I will tell you about in a moment, that she had been discussing this vision with Marcus for at least 2 years before I went into the hospital. The vision involved the house on Elmwood Drive. It involved my absence from the picture, and it had been discussed in enough detail that when the opportunity presented itself, the plan was ready. I became sick in January. Not dramatically, not all at once. A fatigue that I attributed to a long stretch of night shifts. A persistent headache that I attributed to dehydration and the dry winter air. A dizziness one afternoon that I attributed to having skipped lunch. I am a nurse. We are, as a professional category, famously bad at taking our own symptoms seriously. We spend our working lives contextualizing other people's symptoms, and we apply the same reductive logic to ourselves until the logic stops working. The logic stopped working on a Tuesday morning when I collapsed in the kitchen while making coffee and did not regain consciousness until Thursday afternoon, 11 days later. The diagnosis was a brain arteriovenous malformation, a tangle of blood vessels that had been present since birth and that had ruptured without warning. I had emergency surgery within hours of arriving at the hospital. I was in intensive care for the first 6 days. I was unconscious for 11, When I woke up, the immediate medical crisis had passed. What I did not know was that a different kind of crisis had developed outside my room during those 11 days, conducted quietly in the hallways and parking lots and family waiting areas by people who had decided that my incapacity was a window. Here is what happened. As I have been able to reconstruct it from multiple sources, including my lawyer, my mother-in-law's own words in a recorded conversation, and what Daniel eventually told me completely. On the third day of my hospitalization, Beverly called a family meeting at her house. Daniel attended because he had been essentially living at the hospital, and Beverly told him he needed to eat and rest. Marcus and Sandra were there. Kelsey was there. The meeting was framed by Beverly as a practical discussion about how to support Daniel during a difficult period. This framing was not entirely dishonest, but it was also not the primary purpose. The primary purpose, which emerged about 40 minutes into the meeting, was to discuss the house. Beverly raised the question of whether the house on Elmwood Drive was a practical arrangement going forward, given the situation. She used the phrase, "given the situation," multiple times. The situation, in Beverly's telling, was that my recovery was uncertain, that long-term care might be required, that Daniel would need financial flexibility, and that the house represented a significant asset that could be converted into that flexibility. What she did not say explicitly, but what was understood by everyone in the room, was that she had a buyer in mind. Marcus had a colleague whose family was looking in Columbus. The price Beverly mentioned was $460,000. The house had been appraised 18 months earlier at $520,000. The $60,000 difference was not discussed. Daniel did not agree at that meeting. He said he needed to think. Beverly said, "Of course, we just want what's best." Sandra said nothing. Marcus said, "It's a practical solution." Kelsey said nothing. Daniel went back to the hospital and sat beside my bed and held my hand and did not tell me about the meeting because I was not conscious to be told. On the 5th day, Beverly visited the hospital. I know this because there is a visitor log. She stayed for 40 minutes. Daniel was there for the first 20 and then went to get food from the cafeteria. During the 20 minutes that Daniel was absent, Beverly had a conversation with a hospital administrator about power of attorney and decision-making authority in cases of prolonged incapacity. I did not know about this conversation until much later. The administrator, to their credit, told Beverly that any questions about my finances or property would need to go through a proper legal process and that the hospital could not facilitate or advise on those matters. Beverly thanked them and left. On the 7th day, she contacted the realtor. I need to pause here and tell you about my lawyer, because my lawyer is the reason this story has the ending it has. His name is David Kaufman. He is 61 years old. He has been practicing property and estate law in Columbus for 33 years. He has the particular combination of warmth and absolute precision that very good lawyers in very specialized fields develop over decades. I had retained David 2 years earlier to handle the purchase documentation for the house and for an update to a joint financial agreement Daniel and I had drafted when we bought the property. He knew the details of our arrangement. He knew the house was jointly owned with a right of survivorship clause and specific provisions about the sale process that both Daniel and I had signed. He also knew, because I had mentioned it somewhat in passing during our last meeting, that I had some concerns about the direction of certain family conversations regarding the house. I had not been specific. I had not been alarming. I had simply said, in the way that people sometimes say things to their lawyers that they are not ready to say more loudly elsewhere, that I wanted to make sure the documentation was airtight. David had said, "It is." He had also said, "Call me if anything changes." I had his number in my phone. When I went unconscious, I obviously could not call him, but my mother could. My mother, Patricia Connors, arrived in Columbus from Maplewood on the 2nd day of my hospitalization. She is 62 years old. She is a retired high school English teacher. She is the most quietly observant person I know, which is a trait she shares with David Kaufman, and which is why, when she arrived at the hospital and met Beverly in the waiting room and spent 45 minutes in the same space as her, she knew that something was moving in a direction it should not be moving. She called David on the fourth day. She told him what she had observed and what she suspected. David told her that, as my attorney, he had both the standing and the obligation to ensure my legal interests were protected during my incapacity. He told her to keep him informed of anything she heard. And then, David did something I did not know about until I was conscious, and he told me himself, sitting across from me in my hospital room 3 days after I woke up. He began keeping a record, emails, voicemails, anything that could be documented. He also, with my mother's knowledge and cooperation, had 2 phone conversations with Beverly that were recorded in compliance with Ohio's one-party consent law, in which Beverly, who did not know she was speaking to the attorney of record for the property, said things that she would not have said if she had known. She said that she believed Daniel needed to be practical. She said that the house had always been a source of tension. She said, and this is a direct quote from the recording that I have listened to many times since, that Rachel is strong, but she may not come back the way she was, and Daniel needs to be free to make choices that are right for him going forward. She said the sale was the right decision. She said she had found a buyer. She said the price was fair. She did not say that the price was $60,000 below market value. She did not say that she had not spoken to me. She did not say that no legal mechanism existed for this sale to occur without my signature or a court-ordered process. She said a great many things, and she believed she was saying them to a sympathetic listener. She was saying them to a recording. On the 9th day of my hospitalization, Beverly and Marcus arrived at a meeting with a realtor named Gary Coleman, not the actor, and a buyer's agent representing Marcus's colleague. They toured the house with Gary. They discussed the timeline. Beverly brought a folder with what she described as the relevant paperwork. The relevant paperwork did not include my signature on anything, because I had not signed anything, because I was unconscious in a hospital bed. It included a letter on plain paper, not notarized, not witnessed by anyone with legal standing, purportedly from Daniel authorizing the listing. Daniel had not written this letter. He had been told a document was being prepared and had not been told its contents or asked to sign anything. He had been in a state, I understand now, of complete emotional overload, and he had been allowing Beverly to manage things in the way that he had always, in moments of difficulty, allowed Beverly to manage things because she was efficient and confident and because he was exhausted and terrified and not thinking clearly. He had not told Beverly she could list the house. He also had not told her she could not. In Beverly's operational framework, the absence of no was the presence of yes. This was a misunderstanding she had spent decades cultivating and decades benefiting from. It was about to cost her significantly. David received a copy of the listing agreement on the same day it was signed from my mother, who had seen the document in Beverly's bag during a hospital visit and had photographed it. David called Gary Coleman that afternoon. He identified himself as the attorney of record for Rachel Connors, joint owner of the property at the Elmwood Drive address. He informed Gary that no authorized sale process had been initiated, that no valid authorization existed for a listing, that the listing agreement was without legal foundation, and that any attempt to proceed with the sale would be met with immediate legal action, including but not limited to an injunction, a civil fraud claim, and a referral to the Ohio Real Estate Commission for investigation of the agent's conduct. Gary Coleman went very quiet. He said he had not been aware of these circumstances. David said he would expect the listing to be withdrawn by the end of business. The listing was withdrawn by 3 that afternoon. On the 10th day, I was still unconscious. On the 11th day, I woke up. Daniel told me the outline in the hospital room 3 days after I woke up. Not immediately, not all of it, because I was still fragile and the medical team had asked that I not be exposed to significant stressors while my brain was still in early recovery. He told me in pieces. He told me he was sorry. He told me he had not known the full extent of what his mother had been doing until David called him, which had happened on the 9th day while I was still unconscious, when David had explained the situation clearly and without softening it. He told me that when he understood what had been in motion, he had gone to his parents' house and told Beverly that the house was not hers to sell and had never been hers to sell, and that nothing would happen to it without my knowledge and consent. He told me Beverly had cried and told him he was being ungrateful and that she had been trying to help. He told me he had said, "You don't help by taking." He told me those were the most direct words he had ever said to his mother. He told me they had not spoken since. I listened to all of this. I did not say much during the telling. There was too much to hold at once, and my brain was genuinely not yet at full capacity, and I had learned from my years of nursing that the first response to overwhelming information is often silence, and that silence is not acceptance, it is processing. I held his hand while he told me, and I looked at the ceiling, and I processed. David came to see me on the 4th day after I woke up. He brought a folder, he sat across from me, and he walked me through everything. Every document, every recorded conversation, every email Beverly had sent to Gary Coleman, every step of the listing process that had been initiated and then stopped. He was precise and unhurried, and he did not editorialize. When he finished, he looked at me over his glasses and he said, "What do you want to do?" I said, "I want to go home." He said, "That part is straightforward. The house is yours. What else?" I thought about it for a moment. I said, "I want her to understand what she did." He nodded. He said, "I have some options for that." He walked me through them. What I chose was not the most aggressive available option, but it was, I think, the most complete one. 6 weeks after I was discharged from the hospital, Daniel and I invited Robert and Beverly and Marcus and Sandra to dinner at our house. The invitation came from me, on paper, in a card with no embellishment. Just the address and the time, and please come. Beverly accepted because she is a woman who interprets an invitation as an opportunity for the kind of conversation that results in the reestablishment of the previous arrangement. She arrived in a cream blouse and earrings, and the particular expression she wore when she was prepared to be magnanimous. Robert arrived beside her, looking like a man who had been told to be present, but not told what for. Marcus and Sandra arrived together, Marcus with the deliberate casualness of someone who has been briefed, but is pretending he hasn't. I had made dinner, a proper dinner. The table was set correctly. There was wine. I had recovered enough, physically, to stand in my kitchen for 2 hours and cook. And I had done it deliberately because I wanted to be in my house, on my feet, in full command of myself when this conversation happened. David was not there. He did not need to be. I had the folder. We ate dinner. I had decided we would eat dinner first because I wanted Beverly to have the experience of sitting at my table and eating food I had cooked and being in the house she had tried to sell while I was lying in a hospital bed, and I wanted her to experience all of that before she understood what was coming. We talked. Beverly talked about the neighborhood. Robert talked about his garden. Marcus talked about work. Sandra asked about my recovery. I answered everything directly and warmly. I was, for the duration of dinner, exactly the daughter-in-law I had always been, because I had always been a decent daughter-in-law, and I was not going to stop being one simply because Beverly had not been a decent mother-in-law. When the plates were cleared and the coffee was on the table, I put the folder down between us. Beverly looked at it. She looked at me. She looked at Daniel. Daniel looked at the table. I said, "I'd like to go through some things that happened while I was in the hospital." Beverly said, "Rachel, I think we should talk about what Daniel may have told you because I'm not sure he had the full context." I said, "I have the full context." "Beverly," I said, "I have recordings." The recordings were not a secret I had planned to deploy dramatically. They were simply the most precise way to ensure that nothing I said could be disputed afterward. Beverly's expression, when I said the word recordings, changed in a way that was very specific. It was not guilt, not immediately. It was the expression of someone recalibrating in real time. She said, "Recordings of what?" I said, "Of 2 phone conversations you had in the first week of my hospitalization, during which you discussed selling this house, the price you had in mind, and why you believed the sale was appropriate." I slid 1 page from the folder across the table. A transcript, certified by David's office. Beverly looked at it. I watched her read the line about Rachel is strong, but she may not come back the way she was. I watched her face. Robert picked up the transcript and read it. He set it down. He looked at Beverly. He did not say anything. His face said something. It said something I had never seen on his face before, which was a specific kind of grief that comes from recognizing something true about someone you love that you have been avoiding. Marcus looked at the table. Sandra was very still. Beverly said, "I was trying to help." She said it in the voice she used when she was packaging something for delivery as kindness. I said, "You contacted a realtor and initiated a listing on this house without my signature, without any legal authorization, while I was in a medically induced state in the hospital. That is not help?" She said, "Daniel needed support." I looked at Daniel. He shook his head slightly. I said, "Daniel needed me to come home." Beverly said, "Rachel, I was afraid you wouldn't." The room was quiet. She said it again, smaller this time. "I was afraid you wouldn't come back." And for a moment, I understood that this was probably true. That somewhere inside the practical, managing, always arranging Beverly Whitmore was a woman who had looked at an unconscious daughter-in-law and seen a version of the future that frightened her, and had responded to that fear by trying to control it, and had not understood or had not paused to consider that the control she was exercising was over something that was not hers to control. That understanding did not make what she had done acceptable, but it made it human. And I have found, in the 18 months since, that being able to hold both of those things at once, the unacceptability and the humanity, is the only way to move through something like this without it becoming the only thing your life is about. I told her what I needed her to understand. I said it plainly, and I did not raise my voice. I said, "You tried to sell my house while I was unconscious. The house that I saved for, that I bought, that has my name on the deed. You found a buyer for $60,000 below its value, and you told that buyer the sale was authorized when it was not. You did this while I was fighting to stay alive." She was crying by the end of this. Not performing, actually crying, which was the first moment in the entire conversation that I felt something adjacent to sympathy, because crying is involuntary, and involuntary reactions tell you things that managed ones don't. Robert put his hand on her arm. He said, "Bev, just the one word." She put her hand over her face. I said, "I'm not telling you this to hurt you. I'm telling you because you need to understand what you did clearly and completely before anything between us can move forward." She nodded into her hand. Marcus said, "It wasn't right." Sandra looked at him. He said it again, quieter. "It wasn't right." It was the first thing he had said since we sat down. David had advised me about the legal options. He had said we could pursue a civil fraud claim for the unauthorized listing. He had said the conduct could be referred to the Real Estate Commission. He had said there were financial remedies available given the $60,000 discrepancy between Beverly's intended sale price and the property's assessed value. I had thought about all of these options carefully. I had decided on none of them, Not because Beverly deserved protection from consequences, but because I had come to understand during my recovery that legal consequences were not what I was actually looking for. I was looking for truth. I was looking for the thing that had happened to be acknowledged clearly and completely by the people who had done it. I had gotten that. The folder on the table was not a legal weapon. It was a record. It said, "This happened, and here is the proof, and you cannot rewrite it." That was what I needed. That was enough. Daniel and I are still in the house on Elmwood Drive. The maple tree in the backyard turned red last October, and I sat on the back porch with a cup of tea and looked at it for a long time. I had spent 11 days not knowing whether I would come back to that yard and that tree and that porch. I had come back. The house is exactly as I left it when I collapsed in the kitchen. The front door is still the color Beverly said she didn't like. The kitchen still has the tiles I chose and the fixtures I refinished and the particular quality of morning light that came through the east window that made me fall in love with it the first time we looked at it. It is mine. It has always been mine. I am a pediatric nurse. I spend my working days holding the hands of children who are frightened and helping them understand that the thing they are afraid of is survivable. I went back to work 4 months after discharge. My first day back, one of my small patients, a 7-year-old girl named Lily, who had been one of my regulars before my absence, looked up at me from her hospital bed and said, "You came back." I said, "I came back." She said, "I knew you would." I did not tell her how close it had been, the medical part. I just said, "I knew it too." Daniel and I have dinner with his parents approximately once a month now. The dinners are different. Beverly is quieter. She asks my opinion about things now, genuinely asks, in the way that people ask when they have learned the cost of not asking. Robert talks more than he used to. Marcus and I are cordial. Sandra sent me flowers on the anniversary of my discharge with a card that said, "So glad you're here." I kept the card. I have the folder in my filing cabinet at home, next to my nursing license and our property deed and the document David drafted after everything resolved, a formal acknowledgement signed by Beverly and witnessed that the unauthorized listing had occurred and that no such action would be initiated without both owners' written consent in the future. David had called it a practical safeguard. I called it something else. I called it the document that told the truth on paper so no one could ever say it hadn't happened. I am a nurse. I understand better than most people what it means to be vulnerable. I understand what it means to need someone to hold something for you when you can't hold it yourself. What I did not know before 11 days in a hospital bed was that I had someone holding something for me. My mother who made the phone call, my lawyer who started the record, and the house on Elmwood Drive, which was still there when I came back to it, exactly as I had left it, waiting. That's my story. 11 days unconscious, 1 folder, and a table set for 6. If this reminded you to know who is holding your paperwork and to make sure the right people have the right numbers, take that as your sign. Drop a comment, subscribe to Peaceful Drama Stories TV, and I'll see you in the next one.